No one ever came up the mountain anymore. Not since the mine closed, not since the little towns scattered along the railroad tracks faded back into desert wind and rumor. If you asked the folks down in Larkspur or Millertown about the old Wade cabin, they'd just shrug. Maybe some old-timer remembered Jackson's dad, or how the spring used to run sweet and cold back before the droughts. But Jackson Wade himself, he'd made sure he was a ghost long before anyone else tried to bury him. He'd just finished mending the roof for the third time in a month, Nevada's sun beating down, dry wind whirring the tar paper, when the world decided to send him something impossible. It was near sunset, the sky a bruised purple behind the ridge, shadows stretching out across the rocky yard. Jackson wiped his brow and scanned the horizon. Habit, nothing ever out there but sagebrush, the distant flicker of a jackrabbit, maybe a hawk perched on a fence post if he was lucky. But tonight, there was something else. Something moving. He squinted, heart quickening. Maybe a stray cow from the neighboring ranch. Maybe a coyote bold enough to wander close. But the silhouette was too big, too fluid, gliding through the dusk with a rolling, muscular gait. A horse. Not just any horse, a wild one. Its hide glimmered patchwork red and white, mane tangled with dust and burrs, eyes wide, head high. A pinto stallion, all sinew and contradiction, powerful and beautiful, and very much out of place. Jackson's first instinct was to freeze, hands spread wide, breath caught in his throat. No halter, no brand, Mustang, through and through. He remembered what his grandfather used to say about them. They're the ghosts of the land, boy. They belong to nobody, and that's why they'll outlast us all. The Mustang stopped at the edge of the clearing, sniffed the air. For a long moment, man and horse studied each other. Jackson's mind reeled with possibilities. Was it sick? Lost? Driven down by thirst? There hadn't been rain for weeks, and the only water for miles was the battered trough by his porch, a leftover kindness he'd kept out of habit more than hope. The stallion took a hesitant step closer. Jackson held still, slow and careful as he reached into his pocket. All he had was half an apple, left over from lunch. He split it, tossing the chunk gently across the gravel. The Mustang startled, then lowered its head, nostrils flaring, testing the offering. It picked up the fruit, crunching it with visible suspicion and visible hunger. Jackson couldn't help a dry chuckle. That's it, friend. You found the only idiot in Nevada still sharing his lunch with ghosts, he muttered. After a few minutes, the horse retreated, vanishing into the dusk as quickly and silently as it had appeared. Jackson stood there, heart thumping, wondering if it was just loneliness making the world feel stranger than it was. He stayed out under the stars for a while, watching the ridge. But the horse did not return. That night, sleep came in uneasy fits. Jackson dreamed of hoofbeats echoing through canyons, flashes of white and red darting through sun-bleached rocks. When he woke, pale blue light filtered through the curtains and the world seemed impossibly quiet. He rose, stretching muscles stiff from yesterday's labor. He poured a mug of coffee, sat by the battered window, and watched the yard for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the old pickup, the shed he kept padlocked, the water trough still full. He told himself it was over, just a freak encounter, nothing more. He was halfway through his second cup when a sharp clatter snapped him back to attention. Something was at the door. He opened it, expecting maybe a raccoon, or at worst a rattlesnake. But there, standing bold as daylight, was the pinto stallion. Its flanks were dusty, but its eyes shone bright and unnervingly intelligent. In its mouth, it carried a battered leather saddlebag. Ancient, by the look of it, the kind of thing you might find in a museum, cracked and worn and stained by time. Jackson stared. He looked left and right, almost expecting someone to jump out and yell, "Gotcha!" But there was only the wind and the horse and that impossibly old bag. The Mustang tossed the saddlebag at his feet, snorted once, and backed up a step as if to say, "Your move." Hands trembling, Jackson crouched, picking up the bag. It was heavier than he expected. He brought it inside, the horse watching from the porch, unblinking. He opened the flap. Inside, a gold nugget, real, solid, heavy in his palm. Wrapped next to it was a crumbling yellowed map and a leather-bound journal so fragile he feared it would fall apart in his hands. The first page of the journal bore a name in faded ink: Blackwood Expedition, 1907. Jackson laughed out loud, a wild, nervous sound. Some kind of prank? But the nugget was real. The map? He spread it on the table, tracing faded lines and names. One canyon, in particular, was circled in red. He squinted closer. He'd lived in these hills for years, knew every dry, wash, and draw, every fold of the land. But this canyon, Snakewater, wasn't on any modern map. In fact, it hadn't existed in 100 years. He remembered reading about it as a kid, hearing old-timers spin tales of vanished valleys and lost gold. But it was all just myth, right? Outside, the Mustang stamped and shook its head. Jackson caught his own reflection in the window. Unkempt beard, deep lines of exhaustion, a man shaped more by regret than hope. What was he even doing out here? Hiding from the world, mostly. Running from the things he couldn't fix, the people he couldn't save. But now, the world had come knocking. With a horse, a map, and a story that made no sense. The stallion turned and began to walk away, slow and purposeful. It paused at the edge of the yard, looking back, as if expecting him to follow. Jackson hesitated. He had every reason not to go. The desert was no place for fools, not with only rumors and riddles to go on. But something pulled at him, curiosity maybe, or the deeper ache for meaning that had haunted him since he turned his back on everything he'd once cared about. He grabbed his battered field pack, tucked the journal and map inside, and followed the Mustang into the rising sun. The story he'd run from his whole life was calling him back, and Jackson Wade, for the first time in years, chose to listen. Jackson's boots struck the hard Nevada dirt, each step away from his lonely cabin, feeling like a step back into some other era. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting the whole scene to dissolve. The pinto stallion, the mysterious saddlebag, the map with its red-ringed canyon that shouldn't exist. Yet, Wayfarer, as he'd already started calling the Mustang in his mind, moved ahead with purpose, every muscle rippling with energy, every flick of his ears suggesting an uncanny awareness. Sun climbed higher, burning off the last traces of morning chill. The vastness of the land pressed in on Jackson. Mile after mile of sun-bleached rock, stubborn sagebrush, brittle wildflowers clinging to life. He'd hiked these ridges and washes before, chasing survey markers or just running from his own thoughts, but he'd never felt this sense of anticipation. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The horse paused now and then, glancing back as if to make sure Jackson was still following. Sometimes the Mustang would veer off the faint deer trail, nose to the ground, and Jackson learned to trust him. Wayfarer always found a route, leading past hidden springs, around tangled brambles, along animal paths Jackson never would have noticed on his own. As they wound deeper into the hills, the landscape shifted. Patches of green appeared, first just a few cottonwoods clinging to a trickle of water, then whole copses of willows, their roots braided around clear, cold creeks. Jackson knelt, cupping water to his mouth, feeling the shock of its chill, the sweetness that tasted like memory. Wayfarer waited, patient, his breath a soft plume in the warming air. Hours slipped by. The sky widened, clouds drifting in lazy herds. Once, a jackrabbit bolted across their path, and Wayfarer gave a half-hearted chase, snorting when the animal vanished into brush. Jackson laughed, the sound awkward but real, echoing off rocks that hadn't heard human voices in years. By midday, they reached a rise overlooking a shallow valley, and Jackson's breath caught. Below, tucked between rocky escarpments, was a place that shouldn't exist in Nevada anymore. Springs bubbled up in sheets of silver, feeding ponds ringed by green grass. Cottonwoods rose thick and tall, their canopies shimmering. Herds of wild mustangs grazed along the water's edge, their bodies dappled, tails swishing. There must have been 50 horses, maybe more, and none of them showed fear. They moved like wind, like history, like a secret kept too long. Jackson blinked, unable to process what he was seeing. He dropped his pack, heart pounding, then picked it up again, as if afraid the scene would vanish the second he let his guard down. "This can't be real," he muttered. But the smell of water and horses and earth was overwhelming, grounding him in the present. Wayfarer started down the slope, pausing for Jackson to catch up. As they entered the valley, the air felt different, cooler, heavy with the sound of water and the low murmur of the herd. None of the horses bolted at their approach. Some looked up, nostrils flaring, but most ignored them, more interested in grazing or nuzzling their foals. Jackson kept his distance, not wanting to spook them. He watched as Wayfarer moved among his kind, greeted by a chestnut mare and a gray yearling who nipped playfully at his mane. Jackson felt like an intruder, an interloper in some ancient ceremony. He set his pack down by the water's edge and took out the old journal, thumbing through brittle pages, looking for any reference to a place like this. Blackwood Expedition, 1907. He recalled stories, rumors about a lost valley filled with wild horses, a place some old-timers had sworn was sacred, untouchable. Wayfarer trotted over and nudged him with his nose, startling Jackson out of his thoughts. The Mustang jerked his head toward the far side of the valley as if urging him on. Jackson hesitated, then followed. They moved through stands of aspen and cottonwood, following an animal path that twisted between boulders. The ground grew rougher, rising toward a series of sandstone outcrops. There, carved into the rock, were images that made Jackson's breath hitch. Ancient petroglyphs, horses painted in ochre and red, running beside human figures. One horse, larger than the rest, was drawn with a bold white stripe down its face. Jackson stepped closer, tracing the lines with his finger, half afraid to breathe. Wayfarer stood beside him, perfectly still, as if he, too, recognized something familiar in the carvings. "That's you, isn't it?" Jackson whispered. "Or someone like you." He studied the images, horses and men together, running through valleys, sharing water and shelter. He tried to imagine the people who'd made these marks, hundreds or thousands of years before. What had they known about this place? Had they trusted the horses? Or feared them? Jackson pulled out his field notebook, an old habit, one he'd let slip in recent years. He sketched the petroglyphs quickly, labeling what he could. He noted the plants, the shape of the canyon, the types of birds overhead. It felt right, necessary. He realized, suddenly, that his hands were steady. For the first time in years, he felt fully awake. They moved on, deeper into the canyon. Jackson was careful to note the landmarks: a fallen cottonwood, a patch of wild irises, the way the water curled around a mossy stone. He found himself talking to Wayfarer, explaining things out loud. "That's mule's ear there, see the yellow flowers? And those are petroglyphs, drawn by people who lived here long before us. You think they knew you'd come back." The Mustang seemed to listen, ears flicking, tail swishing gently. At one point, Wayfarer stopped and turned his head to look Jackson right in the eye, a searching, steady gaze. Jackson felt the weight of it, the strange certainty that this horse was more than just a guide. By late afternoon, they reached the far edge of the valley. Here the cliffs rose sheer, casting the ground in deep shade. Wayfarer paused before a narrow gap in the stone, stamping his hoof twice. Jackson ducked through the opening, heart hammering. Inside, the world grew quiet, stone walls rising on all sides, sunlight filtering down in golden shafts. At the back of the canyon, nestled among the rocks, was something that made Jackson stop in his tracks: a circle of smooth stones, each carved with a different symbol: horses, stars, swirling lines. Wayfarer stood outside the circle, waiting. Jackson knelt, tracing the carvings, trying to make sense of the ancient language. He realized the stones had been placed with care, not by accident, but by design. The place felt sacred, untouched. A crow called overhead, its voice echoing through the canyon. Jackson looked up, feeling the vastness of the sky, the closeness of history. For the first time in years, he felt not alone, but connected. To the land, to the past, to the animals around him. He rose, brushing dust from his jeans, and looked at Wayfarer. The Mustang watched him with that same deep, knowing gaze. Jackson nodded. "All right, friend, I'll follow. Let's see where this road goes." As the sun dipped behind the cliffs, Wayfarer led him out of the canyon, back toward the herd. Jackson walked in silence, heart full, mind racing with questions and wonder. He knew, deep down, that his life had just changed forever. And somewhere in the fading light, he began to believe in miracles again. Jackson woke to the sound of a distant creek and the warmth of sunlight streaking through cottonwood leaves. For a moment, he forgot where he was. It had been years since he'd slept so deeply, no nightmares, no sudden jolts of panic, just the even rhythm of his own breath in the cool dawn air. When he finally sat up, muscles stiff but rested, the world felt softer, quieter, as if the valley itself was holding him in a gentle embrace. He'd set up a simple camp on a rise above the water, far enough from the Mustang herd to avoid spooking them, but close enough to observe their morning rituals. His tent was nothing more than an old tarp draped between two branches, but it felt luxurious compared to his lonely cabin. Here, the air was fresh, scented with wild mint and the subtle musk of horses. Birds flitted overhead, jays, finches, a pair of curious magpies that eyed his breakfast with interest. Wayfarer arrived with the first shafts of sunlight, stepping out from the cottonwoods with that same quiet confidence. The stallion didn't come empty-hoofed. Clutched in his teeth was a polished fossil, a spiral shell that had no business being above the sea, let alone here in this forgotten valley. Wayfarer dropped it at Jackson's feet, snorted once, then retreated to the edge of the water to drink. Jackson stared at the fossil, tracing its smooth surface with his thumb. He couldn't help but laugh. "You've got a knack for finding lost things, don't you?" he said aloud. The Mustang flicked an ear, but gave no other sign he understood. Still, Jackson felt the urge to keep talking, to fill the silence with the sound of his own wonder. Over the next few days, Jackson made it a ritual to greet Wayfarer each morning, wondering what new gift the horse might bring. One day, it was a crow feather, black as midnight and perfectly intact. Another morning, a chipped arrowhead, the flint edges still sharp. Jackson collected each object, laying them out in careful rows on a flat rock by his camp. They became his own little museum, a story told in small, deliberate offerings. He spent the hours between these visits quietly, almost reverently. He watched the herd graze, noting how they communicated with the subtlest gestures, a swish of the tail, a toss of the mane, a gentle nudge that sent a foal tumbling. The wild horses had their own order, their own logic, and Jackson found himself drawn to their patience. There were no wasted movements here, no harsh words or angry shouts, only the steady rhythm of life, played out in sunlight and shadow. For the first time in years, Jackson took out his old notebook. The pages were yellowed, corners curled, but his hand didn't tremble as he began to sketch the petroglyphs he'd seen carved into the sandstone. He tried to capture the flow of the lines, the spirit of the running horses, the mystery of the human figures dancing beside them. He jotted down his observations of the herd, how the lead mare set the pace, how the young colts wrestled in the grass, how Wayfarer kept watch from the shadows, eyes always scanning the horizon. At night, Jackson lay beneath a ceiling of stars so bright they seemed to hum. He listened to the soft whinnying of the herd, the trickle of water over stones, the distant call of an owl. Sleep came easily, deeply, as if the valley itself was healing the cracks inside him. His dreams were gentle, filled with sun and open sky, the warmth of a horse's flank pressed against his palm. One afternoon, while sketching a hawk circling above, Jackson heard a sound, a soft clatter of hooves. He looked up to see Wayfarer standing just a few yards away, watching him with solemn eyes. The Mustang stepped forward, close enough for Jackson to see the flecks of gold in his coat, the old scars across his chest. Wayfarer dropped a tiny object at Jackson's feet, a button, battered and green with age, maybe from a uniform or a long-lost coat. Jackson picked it up, turning it over in his palm. "Where do you find these things, old friend?" he murmured, voice thick with gratitude and disbelief. It was as if Wayfarer was trying to tell him something, sharing not just objects, but fragments of the past, bits of stories long forgotten by men. He added the button to his growing collection, then sat back and let the silence settle around him. It wasn't an empty silence. he realized. It was full of meaning, of connection, of all the things he'd spent so long running from. In that silence, Jackson found himself again. He remembered the man he'd once been, the one who loved the land, who believed in the power of discovery, who saw every day as a chance to learn. He began to record everything, every new plant, every change in the weather, every interaction among the Mustangs. His notes filled page after page, sometimes interspersed with little sketches or half-remembered songs. He stopped caring how much time had passed. The outside world, with all its noise and pressure and disappointment, felt far away, almost like a bad dream. A few times, Jackson wandered the edges of the valley, exploring the caves and crevices that lined the canyon walls. He found more petroglyphs, some hidden, some faded with age, but all bearing the same motifs: horses, men, spirals, stars. He wondered who had made them and how many generations had passed since a human last set foot here. The sense of sacredness grew stronger with every discovery, and he found himself moving more quietly, speaking in whispers, as if afraid to break the spell. Wayfarer was never far. The Mustang became his silent companion, sometimes disappearing for hours to join the herd, then returning with another gift, or simply to stand nearby while Jackson worked. There were moments when Jackson caught himself talking to the horse as if he might answer. "You ever get lonely out there?" he'd ask. "Or are you just better at being alone than I am?" The days blurred together, a gentle sequence of light and shadow, movement and stillness. Jackson felt the tightness in his chest loosen, the ever-present ache of guilt and regret receding like a tide. He started to believe this was no dream, but a second chance, a place to start over, to find meaning in the simplest things. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and red, Jackson stood at the water's edge, watching the herd gather. Foals nuzzled their mothers. Stallions chased each other in circles, tails flying. Wayfarer stood apart, regal and calm, his eyes reflecting the fire of the setting sun. Jackson felt a surge of gratitude so fierce it brought tears to his eyes. He let himself feel it all: the loss, the hope, the wonder of being allowed, even for a moment, to witness this hidden world. He knew he couldn't stay forever, that sooner or later he'd have to return to the life he'd left behind. But for now, the silence healed him, wrapped him in a sense of belonging he'd almost forgotten was possible. He whispered into the dusk, voice barely a breath, "Thank you." And in that perfect stillness, Jackson Wade allowed himself to believe, not just in the valley or the Mustangs or the gifts Wayfarer brought, but in the possibility that he, too, could begin again. It was on the third evening, after another day spent quietly observing the herd, that Jackson finally took out the old, crumbling map from the Blackwood Journal and began to trace its faded lines by lantern light. The glow flickered over the creased parchment, revealing hints of rivers, canyons, and notations in a script so elegant it looked almost foreign compared to his own hasty scribbles. Every time he stared at it, Jackson felt a tremor of disbelief, a map that claimed to show places that, as far as the modern world knew, simply didn't exist anymore. But this valley did exist. He was living proof of that now. And as he matched the hand-drawn ridges to the ones he'd seen that day, a sense of something larger began to settle in his bones, a realization that he was not the first outsider to be led here by the land, or perhaps even by the horses themselves. That night, sleep came more slowly. When it finally did, it brought dreams of shadowy figures moving through this same valley, men in old canvas hats, speaking in low voices, scribbling in journals as they watched Mustangs thunder across the open grass. Jackson woke before dawn, haunted by a sense of unfinished business. After a breakfast of jerky and creek-chilled apples, he decided it was time to follow the map more deliberately. He tucked the journal and map into his battered pack, refilled his water, and scanned the valley for Wayfarer. The Mustang appeared just as Jackson was buckling his boots, nostrils flaring in the cold morning air. There was an expectant tilt to his head, as if he'd known this moment was coming. Jackson made his way toward the eastern cliffs, the morning sun painting everything in hues of copper and gold. The terrain grew rougher as he moved away from the heart of the valley, the grass giving way to scrub, then to fields of tumbled rock. Wayfarer kept pace beside him, stopping now and then to graze, always close enough that Jackson could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing. He reached a cave, marked on the map just before noon. Its entrance was half hidden by a thicket of willows, the kind that only grew where water seeped up from the bedrock. Inside, the air was cool and musty, laced with the faint scent of sage and old stone. Jackson clicked on his flashlight, the beam catching a scatter of animal tracks, foxes, mice, maybe a raccoon or two, but otherwise undisturbed. The cave opened up into a chamber ringed with smooth walls. Jackson swept the light around, searching for anything out of place. He nearly missed it at first, a faint groove in the stone, a patch of wall darker than the rest. He stepped closer, brushing away dust and loose grit. There, emerging from centuries of neglect, were more petroglyphs, this time unmistakably human. He saw a man carved beside a pinto horse, a bowl in the man's hand, rays of sunlight arching over both their heads. Jackson's breath caught. This wasn't just decoration. This was a record, a story told by someone who had come before him, someone who'd found meaning in this place, just as he had. He crouched, examining a cluster of objects in a hollow at the back of the chamber. Carefully wrapped in an oilskin pouch was a gold tooth, dulled by time, but unmistakably real. Jackson's hands trembled as he turned it over, memories flickering of long nights spent studying old expedition records, field reports, and accounts of vanished prospectors. He dug through the Blackwood journal until he found the passage he'd half remembered. Dr. Blackwood lost a tooth during the crossing. Gold, made by his own hand. Said he'd leave it behind as an offering, should we find the valley the old Paiute called Sanctuary of Hooves. He sat back, mind spinning, the bowl in the carving, the gold tooth in his palm. These weren't just artifacts, they were proof. Blackwood's expedition had made it here, had seen these same horses, had left their mark not in treasure, but in memory. He felt a strange sense of kinship with the long-gone explorers, a bond forged by curiosity, solitude, and a yearning to find something that mattered. He imagined Blackwood, standing in the same cave, turning the tooth in his hand, uncertain whether anyone would ever know he'd been here. Now, all these decades later, Jackson held that story in his own trembling fingers. Wayfarer lingered in the cave's entrance, silhouetted against the bright Nevada sky. Jackson looked up and caught the stallion's eye. "You brought me here for a reason, didn't you?" he said softly. The horse didn't answer, but the quiet seemed to affirm it. Sometimes, Jackson thought, the land spoke through its animals, if only people were patient enough to listen. He photographed the carvings, the bowl, the gold tooth, and then, without a second thought, carefully buried the tooth and bowl again beneath a cairn of stones. Some things, he realized, weren't meant to be removed or paraded around. They belonged to this place, to its history and mystery. He sat for a while in the cool silence, letting the weight of the discovery sink in. He made meticulous notes, drew rough sketches of the carvings, and pressed his hand to the damp cave wall. He whispered a few words he couldn't quite articulate, something like gratitude, something like awe. On his way out, he paused at the threshold and glanced back one last time. The cave felt emptier now, but also lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. Outside, Wayfarer snorted and nudged Jackson's shoulder with his nose, a gesture that felt almost like approval. Jackson followed the Mustang back to the valley, the afternoon sun now hanging low and gold. As they walked, Jackson kept turning the day's discoveries over in his mind. He was no longer just an observer here. He was part of the story, part of the long, silent chain of humans and animals who had found and protected this place. That night, as he sat by his little campfire, Jackson opened the Blackwood journal and wrote his own entry, in ink that smudged with sweat and dirt. Found the proof, the cave, the bowl, the tooth. Blackwood was here. I buried them again. So they'd stay a secret. Some treasures aren't meant to be taken. They're meant to be remembered and respected. He closed the journal and leaned back, staring up at the stars. Wayfarer stood a little ways off, outlined in silver moonlight, calm and ever watchful. For the first time since he'd arrived, Jackson felt at peace, not just with the valley or with the lost explorers, but with himself. He realized that, while he couldn't erase the past or undo the mistakes that had brought him here, he could choose what to do with the gifts he'd been given. He chose to protect the story and to let the valley keep its deepest secrets. Tomorrow, he knew, the world might come calling again. But tonight, under a sky blazing with 1,000 silent witnesses, Jackson Wade understood what it meant to belong, not just to a place, but to a legacy. By the time the first dust clouds appeared on the distant ridge, Jackson had settled into the valley as if he were part of the landscape itself. The routine, wake with the sunrise, greet Wayfarer and his gifts, document the herd's subtle patterns, explore the edges of the hidden world, had brought him a sense of peace he'd never imagined possible. The wounds of his past still lingered, but each day, surrounded by the rhythm of wild hooves and wind through cottonwood leaves, he felt a little less burdened by regret. But peace in this world never lasted long. Out in the modern world, even secrets as old as the Nevada hills had a way of leaking out. It started innocently, a faint buzzing overhead one afternoon, almost lost among the distant cries of hawks. Jackson looked up, squinting against the bright sun. A drone hovered far above, its plastic body flashing silver as it spun in a lazy arc. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, and Jackson tried to convince himself it was just a passing curiosity, a lost toy blown off course. Still, a thread of unease wound itself through his chest. That evening, he found new tire tracks gouged into the soft earth at the edge of the valley. Jackson crouched, tracing the prints with a practiced finger. They were fresh, still moist with the morning's dew, the tread pattern sharp and unfamiliar. He scanned the horizon, heart hammering, but saw nothing but the undisturbed valley stretching to the dusk. He wasn't alone anymore. Someone, or several someones, had found a way in. The next day, a sharp chemical tang carried on the wind told him more than he wanted to know. Jackson followed the scent to a small clearing not far from the creek. There, crushed beer cans, energy drink bottles, and a half-eaten bag of chips were scattered among the wildflowers. A careless intrusion, a mark of people who saw only opportunity and not the sacredness of what they'd stumbled upon. Jackson's hands clenched into fists. He gathered the trash, jaw set, and buried it deep beneath rocks. He knew what came next. The internet, the modern world, had a hunger for the wild, especially if it could be captured, tagged, and shared. And now, some hobbyist with a drone had painted a digital X over the valley, promising adventure, maybe even treasure. By sunset, more vehicles prowled the ridgelines, a battered pickup with a ranch logo, a camper with California plates, and, most chilling, a pair of black SUVs with government tags, BLM, the Bureau of Land Management. The world, it seemed, had arrived all at once, chasing rumors and pixelated drone footage, drawn by the promise of something uncharted and rare. Jackson hurried back to the herd, eyes darting for Wayfarer. The stallion was standing on 3 legs, favoring his left foreleg and flinching as a foal brushed past him. Jackson hurried to his side, kneeling in the grass. Wayfarer's leg was swollen, a thin line of blood trickling down from a shallow cut. It wasn't natural. No wild horse would limp unless something or someone had pushed him too hard. Jackson's anger flared white-hot. He looked around, suddenly aware of how fragile it all was. A few days of outsiders, selfie takers, amateur prospectors, bored YouTubers, and worse, and everything that made the valley special could be gone. The Mustangs, once free and untouchable, would be harassed, captured, or driven away. The petroglyphs, the hidden caves, the silence that had healed him, ruined in the name of likes, views, and easy riches. As dusk fell, Jackson circled the perimeter, watching from the cover of scrub oak and boulders. Voices drifted up from the west side, a pair of men in camo jackets, laughing, stomping through the brush with shotguns slung over their shoulders. "Saw the video," one was saying. "Can't believe there's water and gold out here. Hope nobody else finds it first." A woman's voice, sharp and hurried, cut through the dusk from the opposite direction. "Get your camera. Move. Move. The horses are coming down to drink." Laughter, a pop of a soda can, the glow of screens in the failing light. Jackson gritted his teeth. He crept closer, flattening himself against the rocks. He didn't recognize any of them. These weren't locals, or if they were, they had no respect for what they'd found. He watched as a young man tossed a sandwich wrapper into the grass, then snapped 100 photos, each click a small theft. Wayfarer and a few mares circled wide, staying well clear of the commotion. Some of the younger colts, more curious than wise, ventured close. One even sniffed at an abandoned backpack before bolting as someone shouted and waved their arms. Jackson's heart twisted. He could see the herd's confusion, the restless tension in the air. The wild had learned to fear humans, and now that fear was justified. That night, Jackson sat by his darkened camp, the journal open on his knees, the map spread beside him. He ran his hands through his hair, exhausted and angry. What was he supposed to do? He was just one man, outnumbered, outgunned, and already half a ghost in the world. But he couldn't let the valley fall. Not after everything it had given him. Not after what the Mustangs had shown him. He wrote in the journal by the flicker of his headlamp, his handwriting jagged. They're here, all of them. If I don't act, this place will be lost forever. I have to find someone to help, someone who still remembers how to listen. A sudden rustle in the brush startled him. He tensed, ready for trouble. But it was only Wayfarer, limping slowly into the firelight, the cut on his leg already crusted with dust and blood. The stallion stood beside Jackson, head bowed as if sharing in the burden. Jackson reached out, laying his palm on the horse's warm neck. "Don't worry, old friend," he whispered, his voice ragged with fear and determination. "I won't let them take this from you. Not while I'm breathing." But he knew. One man against the world wasn't enough. The next step, the next desperate gamble, was clear. If he wanted to save the valley, he'd have to risk everything he'd spent years trying to avoid. Attention, conflict, the eyes of the world. He'd have to go public. Above them, coyotes howled at the rising moon, their cries echoing across the threatened sanctuary. The wild was warning him. Act now, or lose everything. Jackson held the old map close, the journal pressed to his chest, and stared into the darkness, already plotting the impossible task ahead. Tomorrow, he would begin the fight for Harmony Valley, and this time, he would not run. By dawn, Jackson's mind was made up. Sleep had been impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Wayfarer's wounded leg, the careless trash, the glow of screens and shotgun barrels in a place that had survived centuries only to be undone in days. The stakes were clear now, the choice stark: keep hiding and let Harmony Valley vanish beneath the world's hunger, or step out of the shadows and risk everything for a slim chance at saving it. The first step was reaching out. That meant breaking his silence, risking the scrutiny he'd spent years avoiding, and trusting someone with the secret that had, until now, belonged only to him, Wayfarer, and the ghosts of Blackwood's lost expedition. He hiked out of the valley, taking an old deer trail that wound through sun-baked rocks and up to a bluff where, just barely, a weak cell signal blinked on his battered phone. Jackson scrolled through his contacts, hesitating over each name until he reached one that felt both distant and strangely inevitable. Lisa Tran. Lisa had once been a friend, a scientist, a firebrand, and now, as he'd heard through the grapevine, a rising force at a national conservation think tank. They hadn't spoken in years, not since Jackson walked away from his old life. But he remembered her clear-eyed conviction, the way she could marshal outrage into action. If anyone could help, it was her. His thumb hovered, then he pressed call. The phone rang. Once, twice. Jackson's pulse thudded in his ears. "Jackson?" Her voice, surprised, then wary. "Are you—" "All right." He swallowed. "Lisa, I need your help. I found something, a place. Horses, wild water, petroglyphs, the whole deal. But it's under threat. People have already started coming. If we don't act now, it'll be gone before anyone even knows it exists." A beat of silence. Then Lisa's voice hardened with purpose. "Prove it." Jackson was ready. He sent photos. The herd at the springs, Wayfarer standing regal by the petroglyphs, the gold nugget and crumbling map, a shaky but unmistakable video of the Mustang presenting the ancient saddlebag. He even included a photo of the Blackwood Journal's title page, the date and expedition mark visible. Within minutes, Lisa called back, her voice tinged with awe. "My God, Jackson, this is history. You're sure about the location?" He hesitated, then gave her rough coordinates, trusting that she would honor his request for discretion. "I need protection for the horses, for the valley. I don't care about gold or the old stories. I just want to keep this place safe." Lisa's training took over. "Send me everything. I'll get the team moving. But Jackson, when this goes public, it won't just be the land at risk. You'll be in the spotlight, too." He nodded, feeling the old anxiety creep back in. "I know. I don't want it. But I can't do nothing." By the end of the day, Lisa had set the wheels in motion. She sent a press release to every major news outlet and conservation group in the region, attaching Jackson's photos and his statement. No names, just the plea of a witness. "A lost herd, a vanishing valley. We must act now to protect what little wild remains." The internet exploded. Within hours, hashtags like #ProtectHarmonyValley and #WildNevadaMustangs trended nationwide. Conservationists and animal lovers flooded social media with outrage, demanding immediate action from the Bureau of Land Management and local authorities. TV news anchors scrambled for any information about the mysterious whistleblower and the ghost valley filled with wild horses and ancient carvings. But the backlash came just as quickly. Some doubted the story's truth. Commenters accused Jackson, whom they dubbed the Lost Pathfinder, of fabricating evidence for fame, profit, or attention. Conspiracy theorists spun tales of government cover-ups and fake Mustangs. Treasure hunters demanded the real location, threatening to swarm the region and dig up every inch of ground in search of gold. Lisa shielded Jackson as best she could, insisting his identity remain confidential. But leaks happened. Old acquaintances surfaced in his inbox, some begging for details, others firing off accusations. Even his old employer called, offering a research grant if he'd share exclusive access to the site. The more Jackson retreated, the more the world pressed in. He returned to the valley, only to find BLM officials camped at the entrance, helicopters circling overhead, and a news crew perched on the ridgeline, zoom lenses glittering in the sun. Some tourists still slipped through, drawn by viral videos, in the hope of witnessing the extraordinary. Jackson took to hiding his camp, moving every few days to avoid detection. Wayfarer and the herd bore the brunt of the invasion. Loud voices spooked the horses, sending them scattering into the far reaches of the canyon. Some Mustangs vanished entirely, driven off by the commotion. Jackson watched helplessly as the fragile balance he'd discovered started to fracture. He wrote angry, desperate emails to Lisa. "You promised help, but they're tearing it apart. The scientists are just as bad as the YouTubers. No one is listening to what matters. The silence, the space, the right to be left alone." Lisa replied, her words fraught with tension. "I'm trying, Jackson. I am. There's a groundswell of support, but politics moves slower than outrage." "Hang on. Don't give up." But Jackson did feel like giving up. For days, he wandered the valley with Wayfarer, picking up fresh trash, bandaging another foal's cut leg, scowling at the sound of distant ATVs. The Mustangs had grown wary, the birds more silent, the air thick with anxiety. One night, Jackson sat alone beside a dwindling fire, watching the embers flicker in the darkness. He turned the Blackwood Journal over in his hands, wondering if he'd made the wrong choice. Had he doomed the valley by trying to save it? Had his act of courage only invited ruin? Wayfarer stepped out of the shadows, his coat ghostly in the moonlight. He lowered his head, resting his muzzle on Jackson's shoulder in a gesture so gentle it almost broke him. Jackson closed his eyes, letting the horse's breath calm the storm inside. "I'm sorry, old friend," he whispered. "I thought I was doing the right thing." In the silence that followed, Jackson remembered something Lisa had told him years ago. Sometimes you have to let go of what you can't control and trust the wild to find its own way. He resolved to keep fighting, even if it meant standing alone against the onslaught. Harmony Valley had survived for generations, hidden, protected by secrecy and the wisdom of Mustangs. If it was to survive now, it would need more than secrecy. It would need faith, courage, and the stubborn hope that the world could still learn to value what it couldn't possess. The morning light brought new resolve. Jackson rose, shoulders stiff but spirit unbroken, and prepared to meet whatever came next. Ready to fight for the valley, for the herd, for the fragile hope that not all miracles had to be lost. Morning in Harmony Valley brought a fragile quiet. Dew hung on the grass, and the air was cool, almost hesitant, as if the valley itself was unsure what each new sunrise would bring. Jackson stepped out of his makeshift tent, still blinking sleep from his eyes, and paused to listen. In the past, the soundscape here had been a gentle chorus, whinnies and hoofbeats, water bubbling, birds trading secrets overhead. Lately, the music was interrupted by distant motors, raised voices, and the low whoomp-whoomp of helicopter blades. But today, the silence was thicker, weightier. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Jackson walked the perimeter, eyes scanning for signs of the herd. Where once he'd found 50 horses grazing and playing along the water's edge, now there were fewer, many fewer. He counted maybe 20, clustered protectively near the stand of cottonwoods. The rest had melted away into the hills, vanished into canyons so rugged only a Mustang could navigate them. It was an old defense. When threatened, the wild hid. He understood the instinct all too well. Wayfarer was still here, though. The stallion stood apart from the smaller group, posture wary but unbroken, his gaze following Jackson's every move. He looked tired, his once glossy coat now dusty, a few new scars visible along his shoulder. But his eyes held the same fierce intelligence that had first pulled Jackson out of his self-imposed exile. Jackson walked slowly, careful not to spook the remaining Mustangs. They watched him, ears swiveling, bodies tense. He felt the weight of their trust and their fear. "I'm not one of the threats," he wanted to say. "I'm here to help." But he'd learned the hard way that words meant little in a world where actions had shaken the very ground beneath these animals' hooves. He spent the morning picking up more trash, energy drink cans, a torn selfie stick, a patch of crushed wildflowers. He wondered, with a mix of sorrow and fury, what the strangers saw when they looked at Harmony Valley. Was it just a backdrop, an opportunity, or did any of them sense the magic here? Jackson carried the garbage out to the edge of the valley and buried it deep, whispering a silent apology as he worked. Returning to camp, he found Wayfarer standing by the remains of his last fire. The horse's tail flicked as Jackson approached, but he didn't move away. For the first time since the outsiders had arrived, Wayfarer allowed Jackson to come close enough to touch him. Jackson crouched, speaking softly. "You're still here. That means something, doesn't it?" Wayfarer's nostrils flared. He turned, walking back toward the center of the valley, then paused and looked back, as if inviting Jackson to follow. Jackson did, his steps slow, wary of startling the few foals and mares left. As they reached a sunny clearing, Jackson stopped in his tracks. Wayfarer wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a young foal, a pinto, just like the stallion, its coat a patchwork of russet and white, legs wobbly but determined. The foal pressed its nose to Wayfarer's side, then, with all the boldness of youth, ambled over and sniffed at Jackson's boot. Jackson held perfectly still, heart thumping. He didn't dare move, barely dared to breathe. The rest of the herd watched, tense and curious. But Wayfarer stood calm, almost regal, as if granting his blessing to this moment of trust. The foal nosed at Jackson's shoe, then looked up with wide, dark eyes. Jackson found himself grinning, an honest, open grin he hadn't felt in years. He knelt, slowly, offering his hand palm up. The foal gave his fingers a cautious lick, its breath warm and ticklish. Jackson's chest swelled with emotion, relief, gratitude, something like hope. He glanced at Wayfarer, who met his gaze, and gave the smallest nod, a gesture that felt like an ancient pact being renewed. "You are family now," the gesture seemed to say. "You belong here, not just as a watcher, but as one of us." The other horses began to relax, tension bleeding from their bodies as they watched the foal's courage. A few mares stepped forward, ears pricked. One nuzzled Jackson's shoulder, her coat rough against his skin. Jackson laughed, the sound half sob, half song. In that moment, all the heartbreak and struggle of the past weeks seemed to lift. The valley was still under siege, but here, in this circle, trust was being offered again, not as a gift, but as a vote. It was a kind of forgiveness, Jackson realized, a silent recognition that even when the world goes wrong, some connections survive. He spent the day with the herd, as he hadn't in weeks. He watched the foal learn to gallop, tripping over its own legs and then darting back to Wayfarer for comfort. He sketched the scene in his journal, hands steadier than they'd been since the first drone appeared. He made notes about herd dynamics, how the horses clustered together, how Wayfarer stood guard at the periphery, how the mares communicated with gentle nudges and shared looks. Even the birds seemed to return, flitting through the cottonwoods, chattering as if to announce the world hadn't ended after all. Late in the afternoon, Jackson noticed the outsiders had mostly left. The BLM teams had retreated, their equipment packed up after a tense standoff with Lisa's conservation group. News vans rolled out, chasing the next story. The silence that returned to Harmony Valley was different, less anxious, more determined. The wild, it seemed, was reclaiming itself. Jackson sat with his back against a warm stone, Wayfarer grazing nearby, the foal curled in the grass at his feet. He thought about everything the valley had survived: explorers, storms, greedy prospectors, the brief chaos of the internet age. Through it all, the Mustangs had endured, relying on the old wisdom of hiding, of holding their circle tight, of welcoming only those who proved themselves worthy. He wondered what his place in the story would be. Not a hero. He'd made mistakes, maybe even made things worse by shining a light on this hidden world. But perhaps, in trusting him with their foal, the herd was showing him what really mattered. Not ownership, not discovery, but the humility to listen and the courage to protect. The sun began to sink behind the canyon rim, casting golden light across the valley. Jackson watched as the herd gathered in a loose circle, Wayfarer at its heart, the foal nestled safely beside him. It looked to Jackson like a council, an ancient ritual repeating itself beneath the watchful sky. Wayfarer met Jackson's gaze one more time, eyes deep and calm. In that look, Jackson felt acceptance, an invitation to stand as witness, as friend, as family. He whispered, "Thank you." Knowing that the real vote of trust wasn't spoken, it was lived every day in the choices they all made, to stay, to protect, to believe in the possibility of forgiveness. As twilight settled over Harmony Valley, the circle held. For the first time in weeks, Jackson allowed himself to hope, not for fame, not for recognition, but for the simple, sacred right of wild things to endure. And that night, as he fell asleep beneath a sky trembling with stars, Jackson Wade knew he belonged, and the herd had voted him back. Jackson awoke at dawn to the gentle sound of horses grazing just beyond his tent flap and the first warmth of sunlight painting gold across the canyon rim. For the first time in weeks, he felt a peace that didn't seem fragile, a peace built on hard choices, loyalty, and the silent resilience of wild things. He sat up slowly, careful not to startle the young foal still dozing nearby. Wayfarer stood sentinel a few yards away, alert but calm, the very image of guardianship. With most of the outsiders gone and the herd returning to the water's edge, the valley itself seemed to breathe easier. The air was cool and sweet. Overhead, a pair of hawks wheeled in lazy spirals, hunting with the effortless grace that only comes when nothing feels threatened. For a moment, Jackson allowed himself to close his eyes and simply listen, to the rustle of cottonwood leaves, the distant clatter of hooves, and the reassuring rush of spring water. It sounded like home, but the calm was not accidental. Over the past week, something remarkable had unfolded. Public outrage, ignited by Lisa Tran's campaign and fueled by Jackson's photos and journal entries, had swept across social media and into newsrooms around the country. A coalition of scientists, conservationists, and even local ranchers, led by an old-timer named Ed Maddox, stepped up, lending their voices and influence to Jackson's cause. Ed had lived his whole life in Nevada, knew the rhythms of land and weather, and, more importantly, understood the difference between protecting a place and owning it. "This valley's got its own rules," Ed had said, his voice gravelly over the phone, and it don't care about gold or glory. We ranchers can help you keep the yahoos out, but it's got to stay wild. With the support of Ed and other ranchers, a proposal took shape. Turn Harmony Valley into a private conservation corridor, closed to the public except for small, supervised groups of researchers and students. Lisa Tran's think tank secured emergency funding, promising scientific oversight, but, crucially, strict limits on any human presence. The Bureau of Land Management, feeling the heat of national headlines, agreed to back the plan. It was a victory, hard-won and precarious, but a victory all the same. Still, Jackson hesitated when the first reporters asked for interviews. He refused every invitation, declining TV spots and podcast appearances, even when Lisa and Ed gently encouraged him. Let the story be about the horses and the land, he insisted, not about me. His role, as he saw it, was to observe, to protect, and quietly to teach. Instead of the spotlight, Jackson poured his energy into building something lasting. He partnered with a handful of passionate local educators and biologists, young, eager, full of questions and energy. They set up modest observation posts on the edges of the valley, using old ranch fencing and camouflage netting. To keep their presence unobtrusive, Jackson showed them how to read the land, to spot Mustang trails in the dust, identify edible plants, record animal behavior without disturbing it. He insisted the valley's new name, Harmony Valley, be honored, not just on paperwork but in practice. It's not about what we can take, he told the students, but how we fit in. This place only works if we leave it wilder than we found it. Under Jackson's quiet leadership, the students learned to blend into the background. They kept their voices low, their movements slow, and their technology to a respectful minimum. At first, the Mustangs stayed wary, keeping their distance. But as the days passed and no harm came, the herd slowly relaxed. Wayfarer led the way, sometimes bringing the foal to the edge of the camp to watch the newcomers. The students were awed. More than once, Jackson caught them with tears in their eyes as they witnessed a wild horse nuzzling her newborn, or saw a pair of stallions run for the sheer joy of it across the open grass. Harmony Valley flourished under its new regime. The grass grew tall and sweet, untrampled by ATVs. The springs, once littered with plastic bottles, ran clear. Wildflowers carpeted the banks, alive with bees and butterflies. The Mustangs thrived. More foals were born, and a few of the scattered bands returned, lured by the restored calm. Not everything was perfect. A handful of treasure hunters tried to sneak in, drawn by lingering legends of gold, but Ed's ranch hands met them at the boundary, shotguns resting across their knees and friendly warnings on their lips. Some online skeptics still accused Jackson of faking the whole thing, calling Harmony Valley a hoax, a government conspiracy, or a publicity stunt. Jackson shrugged it all off. He'd learned the only truth that mattered was the one you could see with your own eyes, standing silent among the wild horses. One morning, Jackson led a group of students to the petroglyph cave. He showed them the ancient carvings and spoke softly of the Blackwood expedition, of the gold tooth hidden in the rocks, of the gifts Wayfarer had brought, fossils, arrowheads, small mysteries carried through time. He urged the students to take only pictures, to write their own journals, to resist the urge to conquer or claim. In those quiet lessons, Jackson saw the real purpose of his second chance. Not just to protect the valley, but to help others learn the humility of observation, the strength of restraint. The land isn't ours to own, he told them. It's ours to care for and to pass along, still wild, to the next hands. Some evenings, Jackson would walk the perimeter of the sanctuary as the sun dipped low, painting the cliffs in rose and fire. Wayfarer sometimes joined him, silent and steady, the foal close by his side. Jackson never tried to touch them unless invited, but every now and then, the stallion would brush past him. A reminder that true trust could never be forced, only earned. Harmony Valley became a place of balance, a rare, living example of what was possible when people chose respect over possession, observation over interference. Jackson found himself dreaming new dreams. Maybe someday, the valley would be invisible again. Its secret kept not by silence, but by generations of quiet stewards. He finished each day the same way, sitting on a flat stone by the water, listening to the night settle in, crickets, frogs, the low thunder of Mustangs in the dark. He breathed deep, feeling both small and deeply, quietly at home. The world had changed around Harmony Valley, but here, in this precious sanctuary, wildness and harmony had found a way to endure. And Jackson, once broken and lost, had discovered that sometimes the greatest act of belonging was simply learning how to protect a place and let it remain untamed. The season changed slowly in Harmony Valley. Spring deepened into summer, the grass thickening along the creek beds and the cottonwoods shimmering with new leaves. Each dawn brought new light to the ancient cliffs and new lessons to Jackson Wade, who now found himself less of a solitary wanderer and more of a quiet mentor. The sanctuary had become a living classroom, not just for biologists or students, but for Jackson himself. One late afternoon, after a long day guiding a group of college students through the valley, Jackson sat with his journal under the shade of a sprawling cottonwood. The Mustang herd grazed a safe distance away, the foal playing beside its mother, while Wayfarer watched over them all, as steadfast as the rocks themselves. The students had left, their excited voices fading along the trail as they returned to the boundary fence. Now, for a brief, golden hour, the valley belonged only to the wild and the watchful. Jackson opened the battered blackwood journal and ran his hand over the familiar cover. It felt like an artifact from a different life, yet somehow it had become the bridge between past and present, between the mysteries of the land and the lessons Jackson had learned from a horse that shouldn't have been possible. A few weeks before, Lisa Tran had surprised him with an invitation to give a TEDx talk in Reno. She said this story, could help people see the value in wildness, in patience, in listening to what animals and land tried to say. Jackson hesitated, nervous about returning to the world he'd left behind, but Lisa's encouragement and Ed Maddox's blunt insistence convinced him. If you don't tell them, son, they'll never understand why it matters. When Jackson took the stage, he left out the details that could endanger Harmony Valley. He spoke, instead of kindness and humility, of the day he'd tossed half an apple to a wild stallion and had his life changed forever. He spoke of Wayfarer's deliberate gifts, the saddlebag, the fossil, the arrowhead, the feather, and the battered button, and how each offering had been more than a curiosity. It wasn't the gold that mattered, Jackson told the crowd, voice steady. It was the way he brought it, on purpose, to share. That's not instinct, that's intelligence. He described the moment the foal first touched his hand, how the herd slowly accepted him, not as an intruder, but as a companion. Animals know who we are long before we know ourselves. They judge us by how we move, what we give, and what we choose not to take. The auditorium was silent, every seat filled with people hungry for a different way to see the world. Jackson could feel the emotion building as he continued. We like to think we're the smart ones, the ones in charge. But maybe, just maybe, the wild knows better. Maybe the truest wisdom isn't found in conquering, but in learning how to belong. Sometimes, a horse teaches you that the greatest act of intelligence is in choosing to reach out, to share, even when the world hasn't always been kind. He ended his talk with a pause, letting the words settle. You don't need a lost valley to meet something extraordinary. Sometimes it just takes shutting up and listening. The audience rose to their feet. Later, dozens of letters and emails poured in, some from scientists, others from everyday people who had been moved by the idea that kindness and respect were themselves forms of discovery. Jackson read every one, grateful and humbled. Still, he kept his focus on Harmony Valley, on the work that still needed doing. Back in the sanctuary, the days continued much as they always had, each one bringing a new small lesson, a new reason to be thankful. Jackson saw patterns in the way the Mustangs moved, the ways they protected their young, how Wayfarer's gifts seemed almost like a language in themselves. He discussed it with the young biologists, and together they started to record detailed observations, moments of deliberate gifting, signs of cultural transmission, complex problem solving. The evidence pointed to a kind of intelligence, even a kind of culture that few scientists had dared to imagine in wild horses. Jackson found himself speaking at conferences by video, sharing his data, answering questions. "It's not just a fluke," he'd say. "Wayfarer's actions show intent, memory, and purpose. There's a bond here that goes beyond training or instinct. If we're willing to pay attention, we might learn as much from these animals as we've ever taught them." But more than the science, it was the humility of the experience that stayed with Jackson. The silence of the valley, the patient gaze of a wild stallion, the trust of a foal, these had reshaped the way he saw the world. He'd come to Harmony Valley carrying a burden of guilt and loss, believing his time to matter was over. Instead, he'd been given a second chance, not to fix the world, but to care for it, to respect it, and to share it wisely. He wrote in his own journal every night, pages filling with stories and insights. The horse isn't just a symbol of freedom, he's a reminder that real connection takes time, patience, and a willingness to give without expectation of reward. Wayfarer didn't have to bring me anything. He chose to. That choice, the act of gifting, the offer of partnership, is what changes everything. It's what makes us family, not just neighbors on the land. What we do with what we're given is the real test. The valley was never mine to own. It's only mine to protect, for as long as I'm lucky enough to be here. Evenings in Harmony Valley became Jackson's favorite time. The sun set behind the cliffs in a blaze of color, the Mustangs gathering at the water's edge. The foal now strong enough to run with the herd. Sometimes, as dusk settled and the sky filled with the first stars, Jackson would catch Wayfarer watching him, as if the old stallion was still gauging whether his trust had been well placed. Jackson always offered a silent promise. "I'm listening, I'll keep listening, and I'll teach others to do the same." The wild had given him a chance at forgiveness, not from people, but from nature itself. And in that quiet act of grace, Jackson found the courage to forgive himself too. The lessons of Harmony Valley would ripple far beyond its boundaries. In classrooms and conference halls, on ranches and reservations, people heard the story and were reminded, sometimes the most profound discoveries aren't about what you can take from the world, but about how you choose to give back. There's a certain kind of stillness that settles over Harmony Valley in the hour before dawn, a hush that feels older than memory, older even than the stones that cradle the springs or the ancient petroglyphs carved into the canyon walls. Jackson Wade had come to treasure these moments most. In the pale light, with the Mustang herd still sleeping, the air so clear it hummed, he could feel the valley's heart beating beneath his feet. It was in this quiet that he'd come to understand the true meaning of his journey and the real treasure Wayfarer had led him to find. Jackson would often rise before the sun and walk the edges of the sanctuary. Sometimes Wayfarer would appear beside him, silent and steady, the foal trailing close behind. The horses, so wild and wary at first, had accepted Jackson as one of their own, not through conquest or cleverness, but through patience, respect, and countless small acts of trust. And with every dawn, Jackson felt the weight of his old life slip further away, replaced by a sense of belonging he'd never known he was missing. The world beyond Harmony Valley, however, had not stood still. News cycles moved on, and the internet's gaze flickered elsewhere, but the legacy of Jackson's story lingered. His TEDx talk continued to circulate, sparking conversations among scientists, teachers, and ordinary people. Young students wrote essays about wildness and humility. Conservation groups cited Harmony Valley as proof that protection was possible, even in a restless, grasping age. But for every success, there were always reminders of how fragile it all remained. There were still those who sought gold, fame, or viral footage, and still those who doubted the valley's very existence. Jackson learned to measure progress differently. It wasn't about headlines or social media trends. It was about each foal born and raised in safety, each wildflower blooming along the restored creek, each student who left the valley carrying not a souvenir, but a lesson in listening. The greatest victories were often invisible, measured in silence, in small acts of care, in the wild things that survived another season. One evening, Jackson gathered the students, the biologists, and a handful of ranchers at the old petroglyph cave. Lanterns flickered, throwing strange shadows across the stone, illuminating the horses and human figures carved by hands long gone. Jackson read aloud from the Blackwood Journal, then from his own, tracing the arc of the story from lost expedition to hidden sanctuary. He finished with a simple reflection. True treasure isn't gold or secrets, or even discovery itself. It's connection between people and the land, between one generation and the next, between the wild and the ones who choose to protect it. Wayfarer could have stayed hidden, and so could this valley. But he reached out. He shared what was precious, not out of instinct, but out of something deeper. That's what we're here to honor. A hush followed, deeper than before. In that silence, Jackson saw tears on the faces of even the roughest ranchers, saw wonder in the eyes of the youngest students. It was a communion, a shared realization that the valley's magic was not in its gold, but in its invitation to belong. Later, as the gathering broke up and people wandered back to their tents, Jackson remained by the cave, Wayfarer beside him. He reached out, palm open, and the old stallion pressed his nose into Jackson's hand, breath warm, eyes reflecting the lantern's glow. It was a quiet gesture, but it held everything that mattered. As the fire died down and the stars wheeled overhead, Jackson's thoughts drifted to all he had learned. The gifts Wayfarer had brought, the wisdom of the herd, the hard lessons of vulnerability and letting go. He realized that forgiveness, both given and received, was itself a kind of wildness, unpredictable, healing, and necessary. He wrote in his journal words for the valley and for himself. In the end, it's not what we find that matters. It's how we treat what we find. We all carry the power to ruin or to heal, to exploit or to protect. True worth is measured in what we give back and in the humility to know we are only passing through. As dawn approached, Jackson found himself wishing that more people could understand what Harmony Valley had taught him. He knew not everyone would listen. Some would always see only what they wanted: wealth, conquest, a story for their own purposes. But others would come to see, if only for a moment, the possibility of another way. He imagined the future of Harmony Valley, a place where wild horses still roamed free, where children learned to walk softly, where scientists and ranchers worked together to defend what could never be replaced. He saw himself not as a hero, but as a steward, a keeper of stories, a watcher at the boundary between worlds. At the end of his next public talk, Jackson offered a final question, letting it linger for his audience and for himself. If a horse brought you a piece of the past, would you take it for yourself? Or would you listen to what it's really trying to say? He watched as people sat with the question, some smiling, some frowning, most simply quiet. That, Jackson realized, was the best answer of all. Not certainty, but curiosity. Not possession, but presence. As the years passed, Harmony Valley remained, sometimes threatened, sometimes hidden, but always alive. The circle held. Wayfarer's foal grew strong and bold, leading new generations through the wild grass. Jackson became a part of the valley's story, but never its owner. He remained, as he always hoped to be, someone who listened, and who helped others learn to listen too. And that is the true treasure, the understanding that what we value shapes what survives. In a world racing to consume, to conquer, to claim, Harmony Valley calls us to slow down, to observe, to protect, and, most of all, to respect. Its wild beauty is a reminder that some things are worth more than gold, and some connections once made can last far beyond a single lifetime. So if this story has moved you, share it. Let's protect the places and the spirits that still believe in us, even when we've forgotten how to believe in ourselves. If you found meaning in the journey of Harmony Valley, don't forget to like and follow the channel. Together, we can keep these wild places alive, one story and one act of kindness at a time.